Welcome back to the Gritfully podcast. I'm your host, Denene Rodney, and today we're diving into a critical topic for entrepreneurs and small business owners, understanding the legal basics for running a business. This might not be the most glamorous topic, but trust me, it's foundational for anyone looking to grow, scale, and protect their business. Legal issues can make or break a business, and the best time to address them is before they become a problem. To guide us through this, I am thrilled to welcome my colleague and friend Gopal Burgher. Gopal is a corporate attorney at BurgherGray LLP, specializing in everything from complex financial transactions to mergers and acquisitions. And I might add, he owns the firm. The firm also handles real estate and general corporate law. So it's a real treat for us to have him here today. And today he's here to help kind of break down some of the legal basics that every entrepreneur should know. Gopal, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure, Denene.
So, before we jump into the conversation with Gopal, I want to share a little bit why this topic matters to me so much. Over the years, I've met countless entrepreneurs with incredible ideas and incredible drive, but many of them run into legal hurdles they weren't prepared for, from contracts gone wrong to misunderstandings about intellectual property. These challenges can be devastating and often avoidable with the right legal knowledge. Entrepreneurs often focus so much on building and selling that they overlook the legal foundation their businesses stand on, right? So whether you're a sole proprietor or a growing enterprise, having your legal house in order is crucial. So let's talk about how we can change that mindset around the importance of legal issues. So I want to get to know our guest a little bit better. Gopal, you have such a rich background in corporate law and business transactions. Can you tell us a bit about your journey and what led you to this field? What's been your driving passion as an attorney, working with businesses of all sizes?
When I got into law, it was to do something completely different than I'm doing now. I was going to be a civil rights lawyer.
Oh my goodness.
Saving the world and doing all those wonderful things. I grew up in that area where, the likes of Thurgood Marshall and those guys were sort of my role models. And so that's when I went to law school, I was definitely going to be a litigator.
Wow.
And then, having completed my first year of law school, I summered at one of the world's largest and most prestigious law firms, Skadden Arps.
Oh, of course, yeah.
At the end of my first year of law school, and discovered this entirely new world of corporate law and just never looked back.
Do you miss the civil rights? Do you miss that? Do you ever get passionate about it and say, boy, I miss the idea of something?
I often wonder,
Okay, what would happen?
What kind of litigator I would have been. But not to the point where I have any regrets about what I've actually chosen.
That's an interesting story. I didn't know that. Yeah. So let's get to the practical side of things, right? Let's start with the basics. I want to talk first about business structure, right? Choosing the right business structure is often the first legal decision an entrepreneur has to make, right? Can you explain the differences between common structures like sole proprietorships, LLC, and corporations? And really, what factors should an entrepreneur consider when they're deciding what to do?
Well, you're absolutely right that choosing the right business structure is very important. At the most basic level, it's between having personal liability for your business activities and not being shielded by the corporate or limited liability or partnership structure. And so that's the first thing to sort of consider, whether you want to be a sole proprietorship where you're personally liable for anything that you do as part of that business. So if someone sues the business, they're suing you. And if they get a judgment against the business, it's really against you personally, versus a corporation where if they sue the corporation, they get a judgment against the corporation. You're only at risk of losing what you've invested in the corporation. For example, you're not going to be at risk of losing your home. That's in your personal name, right? So that's, one set of considerations. Other considerations include tax. How do you want to be taxed, right? You could, have, a C Corp where you're kind of taxed at two levels. You're taxed at the corporation entity level. So on the income, the profits that the corporation makes. And then you're also taxed at the personal level when the corporation makes distribution to its owners at a capital gains rate. So the rate of taxation may be different. The corporate tax rate is different from the individual tax rate. So those are consideration. And, a lot of people are also familiar with or heard about S Corps, which is still a corporation, but it's taxed differently. The entity is disregarded for tax purposes. Okay. And so the IRS looks straight through the entity to the owners. And so whatever profits or losses are made, and it's basically the same as a partnership type tax or a disregarded entity, which I'll kind of explain that in a second. But look through to the owners. And so let's say you make, $100 in profits, for the year, and there are two owners, and just keep it simple and say it's equally owned. In a C Corp, the corporation would be taxed on that $100 profit. And if it never makes any distribution of that $100 to its owners, then that would be the end of the tax story, right? In a S Corp, there's no tax at the entity level, right. But that $100, whether it's distributed or not, is taxable to the owners based on their ownership percentage. Right. Right. And in this case, in our example, it's a 50-50. So $50 will be taxed to one owner and $50 will be, allocated to the other and taxed, as income on their personal tax return at whatever their individual tax rates happen to be. Okay. So those are other consideration, the tax considerations. Okay. And then, finally there's consideration around the different levels of formality that attaches to, and the flexibility that the different forms of entities provide. The corporate form is probably the most formal and rigid, right? And then you have limited liability companies, which can either be taxed like a corporation or like a partnership. Okay. Like an S Corp or a C Corp. Okay. There's an election you can make, with the IRS as to how you want to be taxed. Okay. Like corporations, limited liability companies, as the name suggests, offers limited liability protection in the sense that you are not personally liable for the debts and obligations of the company. Right. So you got the corporate shield, if you will. Mm-hmm. So it offers the same level of protection as far as limited liability protection, but a lot more dynamic and flexible in terms of what you can do. You can slice and dice, ownership and management and economic entitlements in pretty much any way you like. Okay. Not so much with the corporate form, much more rigid. You can accomplish some of that. You just have to go through a whole lot more, and there are limitations. Got it. Right? Because in a corporation, every share of the same class is got to be treated the same.
It sounds like you're leaning towards the LLCs.
It depends. It depends on what your business is, the ownership structure, what the long-term goals are for the business. Got it. Is this a company that you expect at some point to be IPO'd, for example, right? Okay. Okay. Versus, I know that this is only going to be this, and that's it. And so you take into consideration all of those things, and how's it going to be owned? And to what extent, is ownership and management and economics,
plan into it. Okay.
To what extent do you want to tie those things together or have them sliced and diced? Okay. And so those are the considerations that come into play. And the partnership structure offers similar flexibility. And depending on whether it's a general partnership or it's a limited liability partnership, the liability scenario there will vary a little bit.
Well, are there certain, like if somebody comes to you and says, I have 3 barbershops, or I own a cleaning business, or I own a digital marketing business, are there certain businesses that you say, listen, the type of business you have, I think you should go with an LLC, or the type of business you have, I think you should go with an S Corp?
Yes and no. I think that decision should include not just your lawyer, but your CPA.
Yes, always.
Because there are considerations that are not purely legal.
I agree.
And so, I can tell you from a legal standpoint, this is going to make more sense. But when you factor in the other stuff, right, you might come to a different conclusion. Got it. And as your lawyer, I'd be there to sort of help, in arriving at the right place. But it requires a little bit more than just the legal input.
What do you think small business owners do that is a common mistake as it relates to business structure?
There's so many things that people do. a lot of them just choose a structure without ever thinking about it.
Okay.
You know,
Go on LegalZoom and just say, I'll just
yes,
choose anything.
you know,
Okay.
I want to start a corporation, right? And without even appreciating that there are differences between a corporation and a limited liability company. So that's something that happens a lot.
Okay.
And then something else that happens a lot is, you know, they start a company and then they don't observe any corporate formalities at all.
Right. Right. Okay. Until they get that phone call or that email that you have to file this. You didn't do that, right?
Yeah.
Any other things before we move on to contracts and agreements about business structure that you want to have these entrepreneurs know?
The bottom line is there are different types of entity structures.
Right.
And you should understand the differences
Yes.
and which one, you know, is best going to serve your needs, because it's not a one size fits all kind of thing.
I agree.
Before you select one, you should at least go through that analysis with your legal counsel
And CPA.
and just make sure that, you know, you're choosing one that's going to make sense for you based on, you know, how you expect to sort of own and manage your business, what kind of cash flow you anticipate. Even something as simple as that comes into play in that decision making.
Yes, absolutely.
Right. You know, because, you know, whether you want to pass through income to look through to personal ownership, or you want to trap income at the entity level.
Sure.
Maybe you don't anticipate any income for 5 years. And
Right.
so that, you know, that changes the calculus.
Definitely. And I mean, listen, business structures can be changed. So if folks are listening to this now and saying, I might have made the wrong decision, it's possible to change your business structure, but it's important for you to speak to your CPA and attorney to have the right.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Got it.
I don't think there's any substitute for that. And if you do bypass that, you do it at your own peril.
Yes, I agree. All right. So moving on to an important part of law is contracts and agreements. You know, some of my friends will call me and say, hey, I have this agreement I want to sign and I just need to, you know, make a quick review of it. And I said, have you had an attorney look at it? No, but it's simple. And I said, the thing about it is it's never a problem until it's a problem. So I tell folks all the time, it makes sense to look over the agreements or have an attorney look over the agreement.
Well, contracts come in all different types and flavors. And so rather than say what are the key components of a contract, I'd probably phrase it as, what should a good contract do for you?
Right. Oh, I like that.
And in the first instance, it should provide clarity, right?
Okay.
Clarity around what your obligations are under that contract, what your rights are under that contract, what the other party, your party's rights and obligations are under the contract. And so there should be clarity on that, or those things. You know, there should, you know, a good contract should also anticipate, you know, common pitfalls and opportunities for disagreements and provide ways in which the parties want to resolve those things should they occur, disputes. And so I think any good contract should do those basic things for you. And contracts could range from very simple 2-page agreements to complex, you know, 300-page documents, right? You know, so it you know, and you know, the more complex, it just means the more, you know, different sort of possibilities and potentials that are provided for, you know, because people are really thoughtful about all of the things that will come into play in this business relationship, and basically providing for them rather than leaving them to chance and working it out when you know, crossing that bridge when you get there, so to speak, which is not what you want, because every contract situation usually starts out on the basis of a good relationship.
I agree.
Right. And when money is involved, you know, all kinds of crazy things can happen, even among friends. So it's good to hammer out those agreements and anticipate those possibilities up front and provide for solutions while you're still friends. Because once things go south, there's going to be very little opportunity for agreement at that point. And it's going to be costly to fix some of those stuff.
And I do think it's for lack of a better word, it's a mature way to do business, right? I think that if you're signing a contract and you're not reviewing the contract at first, you allow your business associate to perceive you in a certain way. And so the next contract and the contract after that may start to have things that are not in your benefit, but because you're not having it reviewed, how would they know that, right?
Yes. I mean, it's so often, you know, small business owners, you know, we're we have limited resources.
Yes, it's true.
And I know that, oftentimes, you have to choose and allocate and prioritize. Unfortunately, legal and accounting services tend to be, some of the first things that are dispensed with.
Yes.
When budget is tight, because, the need is not as urgent, readily apparent, and it's like kick that can down the road. And look, if you're doing it knowingly and strategically, and you accept the risk and you know what the risks are, fine. But there are risks.
There are risks.
And so, don't do it unknowingly.
I would say that. I mean, and we can't all afford your firm, Gopal, me included, but I think that there are other resources, or sometimes there are some other small business firms that are, attorneys that can take smaller cases, or, so there are, I think I do agree with you about resources, but I just think a CPA and an attorney in some form or fashion is so very important. And when you receive contracts that you're supposed to sign and you have someone review that contract and send it back, it shows the person that you're doing business with that you're about the business.
That is right.
And they can make a decision at that point whether or not they want to be about the business with you, or they can't take advantage of you, so they're going to move on. So I think that's important, but it is difficult.
It is, and it's it's one of those things where we all have to kind of make our decisions, that, in a way that's going to work for us.
That makes sense for sure.
But at the end of the day, one of the things to bear in mind, there are different types of lawyers.
Absolutely.
Just make sure whatever lawyer you're choosing is suitable for the thing that you're hiring them for. And so, when you're approaching your bank or financial institution for a loan or other form of credit, you want someone who's familiar with those kinds of transactions. As your business grow, you might find that you outgrow your jack of all trade lawyer.
Absolutely, yeah.
And so you should look to bring in some reinforcement to help you in that area.
Can you think of a time when a strong or weak contract made a difference for business?
I can think of a number of situations. We talked earlier about, what should a good contract do for you? So anytime you have a contract that doesn't do, one or more of those things, then you're at a high risk for, running into conflicts with no agreed on way out.
Right.
And unfortunately, it can get to the point where it's just, bitter and you end up in litigation and it's costly. And oftentimes, nobody wins, especially when it's a small business and there weren't that much resources
to begin with.
And there are situations where there were no contracts, right, or no written contracts, and so similar type of situation as a defective one. You have one, but it just doesn't provide for the scenario that you find yourself dealing with. And I've seen business owners, for example, with no exit provision in their shareholders agreement or limited liability company operating agreement or partnership agreement, whatever the form of eventually is, but no provision for, especially in a situation where, it's like a 50-50 ownership and no one's clearly in charge. And so what do you do when there's a deadlock? Right.
Yeah. Those kind of things.
And if you don't provide for that kind of thing,
absolutely.
You can really have a disastrous type situation. So,
or if you're a salon owner and you don't have anything in your agreement that your employees cannot take your clients with them, then what are you going to do?
It's you have to understand the nature of your business and know what's important. What's the real value? What's your secret sauce? Is it your client list? Is it your IP? Absolutely. Is it something else? And know that, well, without this, my business would not be able to function. So I need to go that extra mile to protect this, right? Whatever that is. And so that's part of understanding your business will inform what goes into your different kinds of contracts because, not all contracts deal with the same things in the same way.
I agree. Interesting that you mentioned that about your secret sauce, because I wanted to talk a little bit around this idea of entrepreneurs creating new products, brands, or services. And there's a lot of founders that are, especially in this environment where there is funding available. Can you break down some basics of IP, which is intellectual property, and maybe steps that business owners should take to protect what they consider their secret sauce. Is it a client list? Is it a new product? Is it a patent? What are some things that startups and small businesses should consider?
Well, IP, intellectual property, whether it's for an invention, for some written or recorded work, or some secret sauce, one of the first, things that you should consider in sort of setting up your business is what role, does IP play in the business model, protection of this IP from other people freely using it, could your business survive? Right. I mean, what does the competitive landscape look like in that scenario?
Right.
And there's some businesses that, IP just doesn't play a big role, right? Some businesses, just decide that, first mover advantage is enough, or the barriers to entry are so huge that, if I get first mover advantage and by the time other people, get in and catch up, I'm so far ahead, I can just, buy them up or buy their technology and keep it from getting to market or whatever. And I don't need the IP. I just need but there are others for which, it's all about the IP, because without the IP, you have no business. Or without that secret sauce, without your Coca-Cola secret formula, you don't have Coke. Right. And without, the Colonel's special blend of herbs and spices, chicken, it's a different thing.
Yes.
Right. And so are your special logo that identifies you in the market, in terms of trademarks. So you have, different IP include trademarks, patents, copyright, trade secrets, and so forth, all of those things.
Do you think most business owners think about that? These startup folks and these small businesses?
I think it depends on the level of sophistication of the business owner. I think some do and some don't.
Okay.
And, because, unfortunately, there are a lot of unsophisticated business owners, when it comes to these kinds of things. They might know their business, but when it comes to sort of understanding, IP and the need for that protection, something as simple as, you're trademarking your name. Right. And you don't give any thought to that. And next thing you know, a year down the line, some guy down the road, open up business with the name that, even if it's not exactly like yours, it's close enough to create confusion in the marketplace.
Right.
But you never registered a trademark. And so you have no right to stop that person from, you could try some common law, approach, but, the surefire way to make sure that you have the exclusive use
of that,
of your mark.
Sure.
Within the particular, space in which you're operating, because, trademarks are registered by of type of activities.
I can say, it's interesting that you said that, because I recently got something trademarked because I was using a formula of work, a framework. And all of a sudden I had competitors that were using the same framework. And so I said, you know what, I'm going to get this trademarked, which I did. One, because it protected me, right? And so now folks can't use that framework at all. And I think for entrepreneurs of color, it's especially important to make sure that we protect these types of things, because what happens is sometimes, depending upon the type of business we do have a unique way of doing things. We do have that secret sauce. And if we don't protect it, others might feel they're entitled to it. So
that's right. And look, not everything is copyrightable.
No,
everything is patentable.
No.
And not everything is trademarkable. But it may still be proprietary. Yeah. And so, that's where your sort of trade secret comes in, right? And you got to take steps to protect that. It might not be through any of those other registration type processes, but that's where stuff like, NDAs and, non-solicitation or non-competes, which the federal government, recently tried to ban.
That, yes.
But there are different ways to protect different types of IP, and it depends on what you have and whether it lends itself to protection in one form or another.
It's interesting. I always say never depend on the kindness of a stranger. And it's interesting. Someone was telling me they had gone to a meeting, an entrepreneur, and they were presenting their idea, right, to this potential investor. And they were taking pictures of some of the documents, right? So these types of things happen. And there's some folks that before you can even look at their information, they want you to sign an NDA. So I think folks have to kind of be careful and weigh that. One of the things I think that's interesting when you talked about this idea of sometimes you outgrow attorneys, I have had a general practitioner, and then I started to have a need for an employment attorney. And that became another, my general practitioner could handle some issues, but when it got down to it, when we started getting into other issues, I needed someone that had a little more experience. So I want to know, what are some of the legal considerations that entrepreneurs need to keep in mind when they're hiring their first employees?
Well, that's a big step, or it can be anyway, because, taking on an employee, comes with a bunch of responsibilities, legal, compliance, you got to get the right type of insurance, for example. You got to get workers' comp and disability insurance, and employment insurance. And all of those things got to, come into play. And you got to comply with the state and local laws in the jurisdiction where you're located, right? In terms of, for example, paid time off. Yes. Right. All of a sudden, you
have to be responsible for that.
Responsible for that. Sick days and doing all of this. So it's really a big step that should be carefully thought out. Look, at some point we kind of all need people, right? So it's not to say don't do this. It's just to say make sure that you're doing it right and you're being thoughtful about it.
What are some common mistakes that you think entrepreneurs make?
One common mistake is people, often try to treat employees as contractors.
Yes.
Because they're kind of aware of the responsibilities and they're trying to get out from under it. And so they deem them to be contractors, but that's not quite the way it works. They're not contractors just because you say they are, right? There are, certain criteria that, have to be met for someone to properly be considered a contractor.
Absolutely.
And so just be mindful that just because you call them a contractor or even sign a contractor agreement or sign an agreement that's called, an independent contractor agreement.
It's not.
That's not necessarily dispositive of the issue of whether or not they're an employer or a contractor.
You're funny, Gopal, because the thing about it is you're not being all nice about it. The thing about it is that what can happen to you is if you do what Gopal is saying is that there are eyes of the law. It may feel differently, and it might be we might have retroactive consequences for not establishing whether they are an employee or whether they are a contractor.
Right,
that's
because
one issue.
If they were truly an employee and then you weren't doing all of these other things that you should have been doing for an employee, right? And all of these things you had to comply with, and then all of a sudden they're deemed to be an employee, but you never treated them as such, and now you're in big trouble.
Yes, you are.
Because, the law, especially in a state like New York, is very protective of employees. And so you want to be very careful about that.
I agree. I think it's one of the things that people underestimate. I always say to stay silent and follow what you're supposed to do. Because the implications for that can be very, very dangerous.
Indeed.
It's interesting. One thing that resonates deeply with our audience is the importance of being proactive, right? Not reactive. How do we prepare, right? So legal issues often arise unexpectedly, but there are steps that entrepreneurs can take to, what I say, mitigate risk, right? Mm-hmm. So when we think about compliance and regulation, what are some things that entrepreneurs can do?
So the first thing is, as you make your business plan, include a budget, a legal budget. Mm-hmm. Even if it's just for, periodic consultations, with an attorney as you try to, bootstrap things and, and I get it, right?
I get it.
We were all there at one point, but I think that's one way to be proactive because I think, here's the thing with, dispensing with legal services on the front end. It means you pay in multiples on the back end.
Oh, yes. Yes.
Right. And so.
So what you're trying to say, break it down, Gopal.
What I'm trying to say is you spend a few dollars today to avoid spending hundreds of thousands later because, you avoid the pitfalls.
Right.
that can be very expensive.
And it's hard to see that when you have this great relationship with an employee or a contractor or a partner. It's like,
because it's usually people that are close to you, right?
Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
And another pitfall, speaking of pitfalls that people do or make, when they hire people, especially in small companies, they get overly informal and they dispense with the formalities. And again, when everything is good, it works until everything's not good. That employee, I don't know, for one reason or another, become disgruntled or feel like they've been treated unfairly or badly or whatever. And so now, your informal practices, come back to haunt you. So it's important to have, policies and procedures in place that are consistently applied.
Absolutely.
And the temptation to be overly informal is great, but resist that temptation.
Absolutely. And I think, it's hard because you can't be emotional either, right? So when these things come up, you have to try and really be very formal. I think it's important. I talk to a lot of people about that. It's hard, but
it's hard in a small setting. Maybe it's 3, 4, 5 people, and you all gotten close or whatever, and it's tempting to just kind of treat it like family, and and it's good while it's good.
Yeah, I agree. But then when it's bad,
but then when it's bad, and that does happen because over time, things happen, people change.
Right.
Or at least their perception of things change.
Absolutely. I mean, things change.
Yeah.
I want to talk a little bit about when we think about mitigating risk, right? Recently, we've seen a case like Joanna Smith Griffin, a Forbes 30 under 30 honoree, being charged with fraud for allegedly fabricating revenue and customer data to secure investments. From your perspective, Gopal, are you seeing an increase in these types of fraud cases? And what legal measures can businesses take to avoid falling or into this unethical practice of becoming victims of them? What can they do?
It's an unfortunate reality that has become a lot more prevalent, and especially with the advent of it's a lot easier to raise capital these days.
It is.
Than it used to be. The federal securities laws have been liberalized in many ways over the last decade or so. For example, once upon a time you could not engage in any kind of general solicitation, in connection with the offer and sale of securities. But you can now do that. Well, you couldn't do that unless you registered the securities with the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC. You couldn't do it for a private offering. Today you can do that, right? With the private placement. So long as you follow certain rules, you can actually advertise to the world that, hey, I'm selling securities, come buy my securities. So you're able to reach a larger audience, although you're restricted to selling only to certain eligible investors, but you can advertise to the world.
Right.
Which is a huge opportunity in terms of being able to reach people to cast a wide net, even if you can only legally sell to a limited pool of those people. But being able to use the internet, to broadly advertise, or radio and TV and whatever other general means of advertisement. So you can do that, which creates, magnifies the potential for fraud, right? And so you see a lot of that. And so, and a lot more people are utilizing these means of raising capital. And, of course, we're all familiar with, Ponzi schemes of one sort or another, and others who just, lie and misrepresent themselves and their products and their success in order to attract, investors. And at some point, the dominoes come tumbling down. But it's a real thing. It's becoming more prevalent. And, if you're a company that's trying to raise capital or invest it, then, it behooves you to, make sure that you have, good counsel in the process of helping you not just prepare documentation, but the compliance aspects in terms of compliance with securities laws. And look, you can't teach, people to be honest. I mean, you're either honest or you're not. It's a character thing.
Okay. Okay.
But, just know that securities laws, have general prohibitions against fraud in securities transactions, whether it's a registered securities transaction or a private sale.
Right.
And so just bear that in mind that, you're not off the hook in terms of, fraudulent activities just because it's not a public offering.
That's interesting that you said that because I believe 3 founders that were in the Forbes 30 under 30 so far are now under some type of legal situation around their businesses. And now Joanna Smith Griffin is one of them. She is a Black woman. I think it's interesting that 3 of these folks in this particular list are now in a situation where they are facing serious legal actions, right? And I guess for me, I'll put my little Jamaican thing in there. If you take people money, act like it's your money.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's what I will say. If you take people's money, act like it's your money and have that type of mindset.
But more importantly, don't take people's money on the false pretenses.
Right. Well, but if you pretend like it's your money, then most of the time I would hope that you're going to use it responsibly.
Yes, but if you had to lie and deceive people to get the money, that's a problem in and of itself.
Right, that's true.
I mean, obviously, people are going to be less inclined to complain if the venture is successful and they make money. Right. But, but the moment that, people are dissatisfied either because they lost money or they didn't make as much as they wanted to make or thought they'd make or whatever, then they're going to raise an issue. And if you didn't do what you were supposed to do, then, you're going to be on the hook.
Right. So what would you say to these entrepreneurs that are like, I've got to get that, what do you all call that VC funding, that Series A, what would you say to them of color?
Well, do it right. I mean, whether you're of color or not, I mean, it's the same rules apply. So do it right. The offering and sale of securities, whether publicly or privately, is a lot more complex than it appears on its face. And so you want proper counsel that is, familiar with the subject matter and the legal and regulatory landscape around those activities, because, the cost of screwing that up and doing it the wrong way can be quite significant.
Well, that was very gentle of you.
Yes, and as you pointed out with the example you used, I mean, and I don't know, whether that person can be found guilty or not at the end of the day, but they're certainly accused, and it's costly, just to be accused. Even if at the end of the day, you're determined to be innocent, the government doesn't, make you whole for all that you spent defending yourself.
Yeah, but I think 98% of federal actions result in a conviction, right?
Well, in the securities law context, I don't know what the exact percentage is, but it's a
very high
it's
percentage,
a high
right?
percentage because they usually not bringing these cases, and unless they've got some real stuff. They usually do a fair amount of investigation ahead of time,
Right.
And so when they decide to bring a case, it usually means that they've got some good stuff, and you'll know because you'll know what you've done.
Well, I mean, listen, I think sometimes people don't realize that, right? They say, you know what, I don't take a salary so I can have a nice wedding off my business, whatever the reason is. It's interesting that you say it doesn't matter if you're of color or not of color. I bring that up because every summer I do a little lecture with high school students and I talk to them about ethics and integrity and the importance of that, right? And it's important to be ethical and it's important to have integrity.
Absolutely.
Now, you don't have to, even if you've not learned integrity and it has not been part of your upbringing, you should think about the consequences of not having integrity. And I think that when we think about legal issues and stuff, folks have to think, what is the consequence of my action, right? And when we think about people of color, I mean, traditionally they are over criminalized, right? So that means where, a founder of color might have less lenient opportunities around this whole legal situation, those kinds of things. And when I look at some of the cases recently, it's interesting to see the consequences for you if you are of color are much more serious.
Being a man of color, a black man, I certainly understand the phenomenon. And so no stranger to the fact that we have, and in many instances continue to be treated differently on the basis of the color of our skin. So yes, that's always a factor that I might not get away with the same, thing that my white colleagues might do and get away with, or, my white friends or whatever. That's always a thing in the back of my mind, just instinctively, that,
Absolutely.
hey, I got to be mindful that, I can't just instinctively do, what others do without thinking about,
Absolutely.
Is this a situation where I'm likely to be treated differently and suffer graver consequences? Just because,
Right.
not because it's right, but that's reality that we're facing. So that's always a consideration. But, the truth is, when it comes to right or wrong, that should be secondary.
It should be.
Right.
Well, I mean, I would say, listen, if you feel that you don't have honesty or integrity, just think about consequences.
Yes. Yes.
How do you think entrepreneurs can practice ethics and integrity more while trying to grow their business? Is there a way they can do that?
Well, if the person is not ethical and does not have, the moral character, I don't know, you can't bring to the business what you don't have, right?
Wow.
So I say, it starts with the people.
Okay, you say that. Okay. Okay. I thought there was some way to say to them, listen, yeah. That's true.
Well, I mean, think about it. I mean,
That's true. That's
what
true.
if it's your character to be dishonest? I mean, are you really going to suspend that when you're dealing in your business?
Right.
To be a different person in the business than
Right.
you are otherwise. So maybe in theory it's possible. I just don't see it as a practical matter.
Interesting. Okay. All right. I tend to feel that people don't think about consequences when they make decisions.
That's not unusual.
Right. They think about the best possible case. They think about the best possible case scenario rather than the worst possible case scenario. And I always say, think about the worst possible case scenario and operate accordingly. So the worst possible case scenario is that your business partnership might fall apart. You might hate each other in 2 years. And how might you develop your contract so that if that happens, you can be okay? Or, an investor might think that they gave you money and have certain thoughts around what you did with that money and get angry. How might that happen? So I think people tend to think about the best possible case scenario versus the worst. That's just mine.
And I think you're right. And some people, I mean, the people that even engage in that level of analysis, I think are way ahead of the people who don't even, is that
that's true.
there's an issue here to analyze. And so they don't even think about, best or worst case scenario. They just see, the end result that they desire.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Without thinking about, the choices I make and how I achieve this outcome, could be significant and have, repercussions to the extent that, they require you to cross lines.
Yeah.
And sometimes we don't know that we're crossing lines. And that's why, having good counsel, as part of your team is important because,
Absolutely.
The pitfalls of the law are not always obvious, right?
They're not.
There's some things that are, obvious, like, you shouldn't kill people.
That's true.
But do you know this little nuance of the securities laws?
Right.
Right. That says, well, you can't do that. Right. And it might be something that otherwise seem pretty, okay. But within the context of the securities laws, might not be.
Yep, I agree. I've had many attorneys have to walk me off the ledge. I'm ready to go emotional, and they just say, "Let's be, practical." So I do agree with you on that. How do we review? Any thoughts around resolving conflict?
Well, hopefully you will have had a good contract that provides for the scenario that you find yourself in, and there is a clear path that, hey, if this happens, this is what we're going to do. But that's not always the case, right? And even when you have provisions, sometimes they turn out to be ambiguous or there's enough room in there, at least for someone to claim that it's ambiguous. And so you end up fighting about something anyway. I think in that instance, I always encourage people to take a very sober approach, to just step back.
Wait, what's the opposite of a sober approach? That's sober.
One that's very emotionally driven.
No, I know. I agree.
But I say step back. Think about what's at stake, what's really important.
Absolutely.
Try to take out of the equation how you feel about the other person and what happened.
Oh goodness, yes.
And just think about what's really at stake and what are the options for an acceptable resolution, and then work from there to try to get to one of those.
Yeah.
And I find that in most cases, if you can do that, you'll end up resolving the situation in an efficient way where you don't have to spend a lot of money and a lot of years litigating.
I agree.
In court or in front of an arbitrator. That's a whole other thing. You can either go to court or including arbitration provisions in your agreement will give you that option of not having your dispute heard by a judge, where it's generally a matter of public. No,
yes.
well,
public. Yes.
It's to the extent that you file a lawsuit in court, whatever. It's in the public domain, right? Everybody knows, whatever allegations been made against you, whether they're true or false. But the allegations themselves could be damaging, even if they turn out later on, 5 years down the road, to be false. What happens in the interim when people don't know and they're hedging their bets, So one way to guard against the sort of public airing of dirty laundry, if you will, is through arbitration.
Absolutely.
And so if you put an arbitration clause in your contracts,
that makes
because arbitration proceedings are private proceedings. And so you can't just go down to the courthouse and pull the file.
Got you.
Right. With the lawsuit that's filed in court, you're generally able to do that except for certain special kinds of lawsuit like family court matters or whatever.
Right. And I mean, sober is the right word because it can get emotional if you're not careful. Right. So that's for sure. Should certain business owners or entrepreneurs do what we call like a legal health checkup for their business? Like, maybe just review their legal setup. What should they focus on?
I think every business is different.
Okay.
Some businesses are highly regulated, others not regulated at all.
Okay.
And some are, fall somewhere in between. And so you really have to start with understanding the type of business that you're in.
Okay.
And then also understand, how did I get to here? And what steps did I take previously? Did I have a lawyer involved before where I can feel comfortable about what I've done up to this point? Or you know what? I've been bootstrapping it. I haven't done any of that. I need to kind of do a legal audit.
Right.
As I prepare to take on partners or to go do, my Series A round or whatever, wherever you are in the process, right? Before you go, because, first you start up and you kind of bootstrap it and you do things kind of your way, but, to the extent you're the only person involved. But at some point you're looking to bring in other people, whether it's a lender or an investor or whatever. And, your house needs to be in order.
Right.
And so before you go inviting people in, you want to make sure that you clean up your house.
Absolutely.
And that includes part of the legal and accounting audit, just to make sure
everything's together.
Everything's together.
And if you're not going to
bring it, that's a good exercise
to
the extent that, kind of bootstrapped it up to this point and you don't really know
what's going on. True. Want to shift gears a bit and talk about grit. This podcast is called Gritfully because it's really around having grit, right? And as an attorney, you, I'm sure, undoubtedly have seen entrepreneurs navigate really tough situations, right? So I want to know, what does grit mean to you, right? Especially in the context of running a business and staying legally prepared. What does grit mean?
Well, for me, it's a combination of qualities, right? It's being scrappy and being determined
absolutely.
And undeterred.
Absolutely.
Right. It's having that sort of go-getter spirit, not, giving up, right?
Absolutely.
Because, it didn't work this way. I'm going to throw my hands up. No, you're not that. You're good. This way it didn't work. I'm going to try that way.
Absolutely.
And being creative, right?
Yes.
In sort of piecing it together. And,
yes.
And being willing to think outside the box, because that's kind of what it takes too, right?
Yes, definitely.
So for me, all of those things kind of get encapsulated in this concept of grit. And I'm a lawyer, but I'm also an entrepreneur because I own and run a firm.
Yes, you do.
Which is a business.
Right.
And so I know what it means to be gritty.
I know. I agree.
But yes, I think that all successful entrepreneurs at some point
need to have grit.
Needed to dig deep, and sort of, grab a hold of their grit. I am no stranger to grit.
I'm not either.
It's my own, or, sort of experiencing others.
Okay.
Go through that.
Absolutely. And I think that, Gritfully is a word I made up, right? It's the idea of grit, and fully, right? So fully kind of softens grit because when you're talking about having to be sober sometimes, so you've got to be scrappy, but you've also got to be sober. So you've got to you take those licks and you've got to smile and act like, you know what? It wasn't a hard punch. It was it was a catch. And when knowing full and well what you had to go through to get to that, right?
That's right. You can be knocked down, but you weren't knocked out.
Right, exactly.
So
That's it.
Get back up.
You get back up, right, exactly. And nobody wants to hear you screaming about it. They don't care. They're just going to, right.
At the end of the day, everybody has to deal with stuff. And it might not be the same stuff that you're dealing with, but it's still stuff.
Right.
And it still requires the same level of, it still inflicts the same level of pain and frustration and requires the same level of, grit.
Right. Yep.
that it requires of you, even though it might be a different kind of challenge.
I agree.
It's no less challenging.
No, I agree. Definitely.
And so nobody wants to hear you whine all the time.
They don't.
And it's not to say that you can't discuss your challenge with, people whose advice and counsel you value, but if you become the person, but if you do it in such a way where it's just whining, right? As opposed to, looking to sort of bounce ideas off of or sort of collaborate on coming up with solutions, which is very different than just whining about stuff all the time.
Absolutely.
Nobody wants to get bogged down with a whiner.
No, that's true. That's true. But I mean, not even whining. I mean, I agree with you. Absolutely. But I just think that sometimes we don't want to romanticize being an entrepreneur either.
Being an entrepreneur is tough business. I say it's not for the faint of heart because, one, to be an entrepreneur, you got to have a certain level of comfort with risks, right? You're not a risk taker. You typically don't go hang out your shingle.
No.
Because, that requires, being comfortable with not knowing, how things are going to fold from one day to the next.
Yes.
Whether you're going to be paid or have money. Because, being an employee, you're pretty much,
you're going to get paid.
Your direct deposits are like,
right.
automatic, they're like clockwork. Well, when you're an owner, you're the last person to get paid, if you get paid.
That's right.
And so that level of risk is just not for everybody. And so you'll find that a lot of people will say, look, I'm good right here.
Yeah.
I don't need to do all of that, and I don't need to take all that. I'm good right here. Just make sure I get my paycheck every
absolutely.
2 weeks, and I'm good. I don't need the upside of anything.
Right. That's true.
I'm just good with my paycheck. You just keep that coming.
Or I talk to friends sometimes, and I'll give them a scenario, and they're like, "I would have said, you're so calm," and you have to be sober, as you say. I call it gritfully. I call it sober, right? So you want to have one reaction, but as an entrepreneur that's moving in a direction of success. You have to have a different reaction, right? A sober reaction to something that you normally wouldn't, and that takes a lot of skills to do that.
Yes, because it's, but it's interesting because on some level, some people, because of the personality lends itself more or less one way or the other. But either way, it can be learned, because, when you have, skin in the game, and a lot to lose.
That's true, right?
And a lot to lose.
Yeah.
You tend to, be more inclined to be sober in your approach.
Right.
Because, even if you kind of lose it for a moment, it doesn't take you long to come back to what's important and not be distracted by the noise and focus on the thing that's really important. Succeeding in my business is the ultimate goal.
No, it is.
And I can't allow myself to be distracted,
right?
By these things, these people, or whatever it is that's going on.
Right. Right. Well, I talk to my younger entrepreneurs and I just tell them, you don't want any rookie moves now. You've got to look at the long-term thing. You learn that. You get better and better at it.
Yes. And as your business grow and
you become more sober now.
Scale. The pressure grows because you're now more in the spotlight. More eyes are trained on you. Mm-hmm. There's some things that you could have done before and kind of sail under the radar. But now you can't do that anymore. You're a much bigger player in the space.
Right, right.
And people are watching, and, success breeds contempt.
Yes.
Competition is watching.
For sure.
And so that's a new dynamic that comes with being more successful.
Absolutely.
And one always has to be mindful of that.
Definitely. Yeah. So as we wrap up, I want to emphasize some key takeaways from today's conversations. When we talked about business structure, we definitely need to think about speaking to both an attorney and a CPA so that we have the right business structure, and look at some of the factors. We don't want to just make a quick decision online to just hang our shingle. When we think about contracts and agreements, it's always nice at the beginning, right? And sometimes it's not so nice at the end. So we want to make sure that we have the right structure at the beginning, right?
Yes. We want to be thoughtful about our business relationships and papering them.
Right. Exactly. Even if it's a friend or family member. In terms of intellectual property, we have to think about what do we have that we want to have possession of and we want to protect, and what kind of risk do we have for not protecting it, right? Especially for startups and small businesses, right? And as your business grows, scales, and changes, if there comes a time when you do need to have employees, if you're not a sole entrepreneur, you want to make sure that you adhere to the law. First of all, to be aware of the law, and then adhere to it. Because if you don't, it's one area in law where you can easily and quickly be monitored and sanctioned, so to speak. And I think when we think about mitigating risk, we talked a little bit about the importance of compliance and regulations depending upon the industry that you're in. The quote of the day is sober.
Yes, we should always strive to be sober in our approach to our various business decisions.
Right, exactly. And I think, when you think about sober, you think about a certain amount of calm, right? And level-headedness. And if we think about things like fraud, misrepresentation, dispute resolution, all these types of things, if we are clear-headed and calm in our decision-making, maybe we'll end up on the good side of things.
Yes, I like to say be deliberate.
Be deliberate.
In your decision-making.
Right.
And there'll be many, and some of them will be tough, right? They'll, have you make decisions about splitting babies.
Right. Right.
But that's part of being an entrepreneur.
Yeah.
Making tough decisions.
Absolutely.
But making them with integrity and from a position of knowledge, right? And then living with the consequences, because that's what we do. Right. We use the information that we have in that moment to make the best decisions we can make. And then you live with the consequences.
That's true. That is true. But you should know the consequences, though. Or at least some of them.
You should know, the different potential, consequences that attach to the different, decisions that you make.
Right.
Decision to go this way versus that way, and what that could mean. So that's part of being informed.
Absolutely.
That's part of being informed.
Right.
And, being informed doesn't mean you don't take risk.
No.
It just means that you're aware of the risks you're taking.
Absolutely.
And you take those risks with full knowledge that this is what I'm doing.
Right. And there are resources available for entrepreneurs as it relates to legal support. So I think they have to, maybe do a little bit of searching, and then we'll try and find out before this podcast airs. We may have some resources for folks, but don't feel that it's intimidating and that you can't get legal support. You can, and it's important because in the end you will have to pay. That's it for today's episode of Gritfully. And I want to thank our guest Gopal Burgher of BurgherGray LLP. Do you want to give some contact information, Gopal?
Sure.
Okay.
For anyone that wishes to reach out and consult with us about any particular business issue, you can reach me personally at Gopal Burgher at 646-513-3231 is our main number. I'm at extension 102. I am at GBurgher and at BurgherGray.com.
Thank you for tuning in, and don't forget to like, follow, and connect with us. You can find us on Instagram at Z Strategies and on LinkedIn or Facebook by searching Zebra Strategies. You can also visit us at zebrastrategies.com. And you can follow me personally on Instagram, DJ_Wanderlust, TikTok at Denene Rodney, and in the words of my Jamaican grandmother, walk good. Take care.